A grieving teenager stepped onto the balcony of his isolated mountain cabin, expecting to scare away an animal from the roof, but his flashlight revealed a towering man crouched high inside a pine tree, smiling down at him through the snowstorm without blinking once. This is Kryptic Works, where forgotten horrors speak again. The disturbing encounter happened near Mount Bachelor in Oregon, after a 17-year-old asked his mother for one final weekend alone at the family's remote vacation cabin before it was sold. His father had recently passed away, and the cabin carried years of hunting trips, snowboarding weekends, and quiet nights spent together deep in the mountains. Wanting time away from everyone, he drove into the wilderness with Midnight, the family's black lab mix, planning to stay alone for a few days while the winter season settled across the forest. The cabin sat far from the nearest road with nothing surrounding it except towering pine trees and deep, untouched snow. A massive tree stood in front of the property, with one enormous branch stretching sideways high above the ground, like a bench hanging in the air. The family jokingly called it the sitting tree because it looked large enough for somebody to rest on. The first 2 days felt peaceful. He spent the afternoons snowboarding nearby trails, while Midnight wandered around the property chasing scents through the snow. During the evenings, he played video games downstairs, cooked simple meals, and tried not to think too much about his father. The isolation felt comforting at first because the mountain gave him complete silence away from the rest of the world. Everything changed on the third day when a brutal blizzard rolled across the mountain and buried the property beneath fresh snow. By afternoon, visibility had almost disappeared beyond the tree line, and the teenager remained trapped inside, while heavy wind rattled the cabin walls. At some point during the storm, he opened the front door to let Midnight outside, and immediately noticed footprints pressed deep into the snow surrounding the cabin. The tracks emerged directly from the woods, circled the entire property, then disappeared uphill behind the house. He stood frozen on the porch, staring at them, while snow continued falling around him. The nearest neighbors lived miles away, and nobody should have been hiking through the forest during weather like that. Even so, he convinced himself the tracks probably belonged to a lost hiker or another snowboarder who accidentally crossed the property before leaving again. That night, he locked every door, pulled the blackout curtains across the windows, and stayed downstairs longer than usual, trying to ignore the growing tension sitting in the back of his mind. Close to midnight, he finally headed upstairs with Midnight following closely behind him. Outside, the blizzard had faded into complete silence. The wind stopped moving through the trees, and the entire mountain suddenly felt unnaturally still. Then Midnight reacted. The dog lifted her head toward the staircase leading downstairs and became completely rigid. Seconds later, she jumped off the bed, sprinted down the hallway, and began pacing near the front door with growing panic. At first, he assumed she needed to go outside, so he followed her downstairs and unlocked the door. The moment the door opened, Midnight froze. She slowly stepped onto the porch and stared toward the dark forest near the sitting tree. Every muscle in her body looked tense as she lowered herself closer to the ground. She was not behaving like a dog asking to go outside. She looked like an animal that had spotted a predator hiding somewhere in the darkness. A heavy feeling settled into his chest immediately. Afraid Midnight might run toward whatever she sensed, he grabbed her collar, dragged her back inside, and locked the deadbolt again. Even after returning upstairs, Midnight refused to calm down. She stood beside the bed, staring toward the hallway, as though listening for movement somewhere below them. Then sometime after midnight, he heard footsteps crossing the roof above his head. The sound moved slowly through the snow with deliberate weight. These were not branches scraping against the cabin or ice falling from the roof. The footsteps sounded heavy enough to belong to something large pacing directly overhead. He later described it as sounding almost like hooves moving across the cabin. The noise continued for several seconds before stopping completely. The silence afterward felt worse. Midnight suddenly turned away from the hallway and stared directly toward the sliding glass doors leading onto the second-floor balcony. Trying desperately to convince himself the noise came from an animal, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside into the freezing air. His hands shook as the beam moved across the clearing below. At first, he pointed the flashlight toward the roof expecting to see an animal staring back at him, but the roof looked empty. Then Midnight began growling low in her throat while staring toward the woods. He lowered the flashlight toward the sitting tree. Something was crouched on the massive branch, high above the snow. The figure looked like an impossibly tall man, gripping the upper branches with long arms while balancing silently in the tree. Its face carried a grin stretched unnaturally wide across its mouth, and it stared directly at him, without moving. He panicked and dropped the flashlight onto the balcony floor. The noise cracked through the mountain silence. He immediately grabbed the flashlight again and pointed it back toward the tree. The figure was gone. No branches moved. No footsteps echoed through the snow. Whatever had been sitting in that tree disappeared into the darkness within seconds. He rushed back inside with Midnight, locked the balcony doors, and pulled the curtains shut. Both of them stayed hidden in the bedroom, while Midnight trembled violently beside him. Then the tapping started downstairs. A slow and deliberate tapping struck one of the windows beneath the bedroom. The sound continued for several minutes before stopping completely. Moments later, he heard heavy footsteps crunching through the snow outside as something slowly circled the cabin wall by wall. Then the tapping returned directly behind him against the small bathroom window beside the bed. Whatever stood outside had moved uphill around the cabin. The tapping continued through the entire night. Sometimes it stopped long enough for footsteps to return onto the roof overhead. Other times he heard movement outside the bedroom balcony, while Midnight remained frozen against him in complete fear. When morning finally arrived, he forced himself to open the curtains. The balcony outside his room was covered in footprints. Tracks stretched across the roof above the cabin, and a massive trail circled the property, showing something had walked around the house for hours during the night. The footprints eventually disappeared back into the forest near the sitting tree. He packed everything immediately, loaded Midnight into the truck, and drove off the mountain without looking back once. Soon after, the family sold the cabin forever, but somewhere deep in the forests near Mount Bachelor, something still waits in those trees, and for one entire night, it wanted him to know he was never alone.